Kamal, today is one of those seminal days where we're going to hear the outcome of an inquiry which is going to lay bare a state scandal, failings of the NHS, failings of big business and pharma. We're going to finally get, after decades of victims wanting answers, the results of the infected blood inquiry.
Yes, it's just been published. And also in Iran, the death of the President Ibrahim Raisi. Will be with our expert Roland Oliphant, taking us through what that means for the country and also for global politics.
Another big subject, always a favourite with Telegraph readers, cyclists, and whether bikes should carry number plates so that we can point out when cyclists are flouting the law.
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Kamal Ahmed.
And me, Camilla Tominey. Kamal, the infected blood inquiry, 7 years in the making. The findings have just come out today. As we speak, the Prime Minister is in Parliament making an apology to the victims. We covered this in our Friday episode at great length. You look at the mounting evidence, and we'll get onto the findings in just a moment, but you look at actually what happened, the idea of people being given contaminated blood, which is a scandal in itself. So just to take people listening to this back, this happened in the 70s and 80s. Children and adults suffering with haemophilia largely, it also affected patients who were given transfusions, were given blood products called factor VIII, thinking that they were miracle drugs, but actually they contaminated them with diseases including hepatitis C, HIV. Some of them went on to develop AIDS. 3,000 have died. Thousands more have been scarred for life by this scandal. And what we are fast discovering today is not only that it could have been avoided, but to compound what I think has been rightly described as the biggest treatment scandal in NHS history, not only could it have been prevented, but successive governments covered it up.
It's amazing, isn't it, Camilla? We all have covered statutory inquiries in the past. I remember covering mad cow disease, BSE, the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, the Hunt report into the Iraq War, Hillsborough. Every single time you get this incredibly powerful idea of people in power not understanding the victims and always thinking of their side, always thinking that they need to defend a position rather than be honest, in this case with tens of thousands of patients and their families that have been affected by this horrific event. It was Bishop James Jones, he chaired the Hillsborough inquiry. He used this incredible phrase. He said, "the patronising disposition of unaccountable power." And I think today we have really seen why it is so important that we have true transparency, that we have accountability and honesty from the start. The first warnings about the possibilities of pooled blood donation being dangerous was in the 1950s.
Extraordinary.
In the 1970s, the World Health Assembly, which is part of the World Health Organization, was saying that there were risks to these pooled donors. There was evidence. And now, as you say, all these decades later, we're getting what happened. But Camilla, take us through the findings. What have we actually found out today about what happened?
I think the findings are almost best encapsulated in one quote from Sir Brian Langstaff, who has chaired this inquiry since 2017. It was announced by Theresa May. There had been previous inquiries which didn't have statutory powers. So this is the ultimate report back, not just to victims and their families, but also to the public. And this is what he said. "This disaster was not an accident. The infections happened because those in authority, doctors, the blood services and successive governments did not put patients first. The response by those in authority served to compound people's suffering." He said patients were knowingly exposed to unacceptable risks of infection and that there were a litany of failures. So in a nutshell, what we learnt today, it was confirmation of, I think, our worst fears. This crisis was largely avoidable, People knew the risks and didn't tell patients. Patients, including children, were used effectively as guinea pigs. In some cases, children's parents weren't told that they had been contaminated with the blood products they were given, and that there was a conspiracy of silence. So we have a closing of ranks by ministers, civil servants, doctors, people working in pharma to protect their own interests at the expense of patients.
Please do go to our website to look at the detail. This is an incredibly comprehensive report going, I think, over 1,000 pages, many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of words. It is really necessary that we take time to read that and to look at some of the recommendations. On the side of the recommendations, the major issue, as you say, not just the apology, which Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, is due to be making just at the time this podcast is going to be published today, but also compensation. So apology, real and meaningful, and compensation. So far, we've had some small interim payments valued at about £40 million, £100,000 to some affected families. Often, obviously, a tiny amount of money in comparison to what people have been through. So that needs to be looked at, and the government looks like it's going to announce possibly somewhere north of £10 billion in compensation tomorrow. I think it is important that the victims today, it is their day. It is their day to hear the stories and how badly they have been treated. Tomorrow is probably the day about what is the compensation, how are they going to be treated. And this point that the pharmaceutical firms, as you said in our podcast special that we did on Friday, the pharmaceutical firms who, in the search for profit, continued when there was much evidence that there was contamination issues, continued production. And in Germany, for example, this scandal has affected so many countries,
Yes.
America, the European continent. In Germany, there was an insistence, the German authorities, that the pharmaceutical companies, where they were culpable, were made to pay. So it wasn't just taxpayers who were left to pay. And I think that's going to be an important discussion for tomorrow.
Can we also just focus on Trelaw's school in Hampshire? Because that was described by Sir Brian Langstaff as a microcosm of what happened across the UK. This was the school which was home to a number of pupils with disabilities and also a number of pupils with haemophilia. It was at this school really that formed the centre of the victims' claim for compensation, because you had boys whose parents weren't told that they had been given these contaminated blood products, and then some of them, unbelievably, Kamal, weren't actually told they'd been infected. I just want to pick this line out of the report because as a mum, I just looked at it and I must admit I welled up a bit because this is quite unbelievable. Young boys at the school were told in batches of 5 if they had or had not tested positive for HIV in front of each other before being immediately sent back to class. In other cases, doctors made the unconscionable decision not to tell pupils and parents that they had tested positive for the disease at all. So the other thing we discover from this report is there are still people walking around in the UK that don't know they've been infected by contaminated blood.
And the report said that it's probably a lot of children still being affected, and a victim of this scandal is still dying every 4 days. So this scandal is still present in the UK, and I'm sure in many other parts of the world. The point will now be, who is held to account? Will there be prosecutions? Many people have been named as having serious questions to answer. Constant look for what is described as conclusive evidence rather than what would now be known as a risk-based analysis. And Camilla, when we were chatting before we came into the studio today, you were saying transparency at least will be part of the journey.
Why at the time? I mean, I appreciate that we can look back at this retrospectively and hindsight's an amazing thing. But if they knew that the products were contaminated at the time, which we know now conclusively that they did, why weren't patients told, look, this is a miracle drug and this will help you if you've got haemophilia from having a bleed out and dying. But on the other hand, we cannot guarantee that this product might not infect you with hepatitis C or indeed HIV, which they knew as long ago as 1982. Why didn't they give patients and their parents, if that was the case, those options, and then they could have weighed them up? We talk about individuals who are named in the report. I don't think this is a day for looking for scapegoats, because what we've discovered very, very clearly is that successive governments are to blame. Ken Clarke, the former health secretary, now Lord Clarke, has been singled out for criticism because he turned around and said that there wasn't a chance that these products were contaminated with HIV.
So this goes right back, as you say, many different governments, both Conservative and Labour. And Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, has said that the Labour Party will support the government's position on things like compensation. So there's a small ray of sunshine there. The Telegraph's Cara McGoogan, who's done some remarkable reporting on this over the last few years, she's been dissecting the report all morning. She's the presenter of the Bed of Lies podcast on the affected blood scandal, and she's got a new book on all this called The Poison Line. Cara, thank you so much for joining us. You're literally from where I think you've been looking at the report all day. Just give us an overview of, you've been speaking to victims particularly. What has been the response of the people so affected by the substance of what this inquiry is talking about?
There's a real feeling of vindication today, Kamal. People have waited 40 years to hear the news that today has been delivered, that the treatment which gave them HIV and hepatitis should never have been licensed in the UK. Back in 1973, when we approved use of Factor VIII, this treatment for haemophilia, which was deemed a wonder drug, made by American companies, and we approved that for use to be imported into the UK, it should never have happened. That was because of the risks that were known at the time of hepatitis being in that product, and the high-risk sources that pharmaceutical companies were going to collect plasma, and that was prisons, outside gay nightclubs, in impoverished centres of American cities with high areas of drug use and sex work, and pooling it together to make a deadly product. And the chair today has said we should never have been bringing that into the UK. But it's also bittersweet because 1,250 people in the UK contracted HIV from that product. 2/3 of those have died, and 380 who contracted it were children. So what we're hearing is that those people were needlessly harmed by this product, Factor VIII. And then what we've also heard is that the government embarked on a cover-up. It tried to hide the truth, and for 40 years the harm has been compounded. So I think people here are feeling pleased with what's finally been said, but they're also a bit apprehensive that the government still needs to make good on Sir Brian Langstaff's recommendations.
Cara, Sir Brian hasn't pulled any punches, has he, when it comes to government accountability? He's saying that compensation must be paid immediately. People listening to this might think, well, that's fine and taxpayers should shoulder some of this burden, but what about the pharma companies?
In America, the pharmaceutical companies paid $100,000 to each victim who was infected with HIV. In Germany, we saw pharma companies be forced to contribute around half of the compensation pot, and that happened in Japan as well. I think so much time has passed now that those companies have gone through restructuring, sales, mergers, that the companies that we knew back then, Baxter, Bayer being two of them, would say, we're no longer the people that made that treatment. We've sold that division. It's not our responsibility. So I think the government will face an uphill battle if it wants to try and embark on that, if it wants to try and embark on getting money back from the pharma companies. But as you say, we could be looking at upwards of £10 billion, and those companies are responsible for making this treatment that infected people here. So why should we not be looking at recouping some of that?
Accountability, Cara, is so difficult. What has Sir Brian said about possible prosecutions? Because obviously there's the monetary compensation, but there's also what might be described as justice.
So I don't want this to sound wishy-washy, because it's not. This is a damning report, a damning indictment of what happened. But looking at the report, it feels it's not pinning the blame on any one individual. It's quite disparate. There is blame across the board, systemic blame. Systemic mistakes is what Sir Brian said. So that means that we're unlikely, I think, to be seeing prosecutions out of this. It determines to be seen. I think other people will be poring over it as well and looking for bits. There's been talk of what could happen to Trelaw's school, where 122 boys with haemophilia went, and up to 80 of whom have now died, very sadly from infections they contracted while at the school. But I'm not sure if we'll be seeing criminal prosecutions out of this.
Finally, Cara, this finding that hundreds more may be infected than is currently known, and this recommendation that these people should be found, I mean, how could that possibly work? I suppose you'd have to have some national screening programme for both Hep C and HIV.
Yes, well, in the report, Sir Brian recommends how we could do that, which would be to, when you go to the doctor, if it's in your medical records that you had a blood transfusion before 1996, you should be offered a hepatitis C test. Actually, Camilla, this isn't the first time that's been recommended, which is quite shocking. There was a previous inquiry in Scotland in 2015, and it found that there should be a hepatitis C test given to all these people that have blood transfusions, and it's never been done. So to this day, there is hundreds, if not thousands, of people who could be living with hepatitis C and not know from medical treatment that they had back in the 70s, 80s, or early 90s.
Cara, we'll let you get back to the report and your reporting, and we look forward to both reading it and hearing it in your own podcast series. I know you're doing an update to Bed of Lies in reaction to the inquiry findings. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you, Cara.
Thank you.
Cara's also been speaking, obviously, directly to victims.
Yeah, Jason Evans is the director and founder of Factor 8, which is one of the main campaign groups on this. He lost his father in 2017. Same year that the inquiry was started, to an AIDS-related illness after he was contaminated with Factor 8.
And she's spoken to him today to get his reaction to the report.
So, big day today. How are you feeling?
I mean, as soon as I saw that recommendation that commercial factor concentrates never should have been licensed, that was everything, because that's the point I've personally and many other people have been trying to make for a long time. And so to see that was just mega. You know, and even the fact the inquiry obviously chose to include that point in their press release, that point alone is everything. And then, of course, you've got the whole catalogue of all of the failings throughout the 70s, throughout the 80s.
The report's over 2,500 words. It's been a very busy morning, so you probably haven't had a lot of time to reflect. But have you had any thoughts about your dad and what this has all been for so far today?
In relation to my own personal circumstances, when I read the summary, and then as soon as I'd read the summary, I think I was one of the only people in the room with the community who immediately flipped open a laptop, Control F, and went straight to the HIV haemophilia litigation part of the report, because my dad was involved in that. It was kind of the last part of his fight for justice and redress. And to see what Sir Brian had to say about that was also very meaningful, because he talked about basically how wrong the hepatitis waiver was, that's kind of become a bit of an infamous issue at this point, and that the government should have provided proper compensation then, and we're still waiting for proper compensation now. So I did think about my dad when I read that part, and of course thinking about the fact that if what Sir Brian said should have happened, which is that concentrates never should have been licensed for use, then my dad probably wouldn't have been infected with HIV and would probably still be alive today. So bearing all that in mind is a pretty big deal, I suppose.
Jason talking about his experience there. And I think just to end this section of the podcast, to Sir Brian Langstaff himself, he's the former judge who chaired this inquiry. I think the power of his comments and his expertise, he actually, right back in 1998, he was the person who was lead counsel for the inquiry into children's deaths at the Bristol Royal Infirmary. Again, an inquiry which showed, maybe we haven't spoken enough about the NHS and its problems of constantly defending, covering up. The Bristol Royal Infirmary inquiry found some really systemic failings within the health service in the UK. He's someone who really knows about this subject over many, many years. He has chaired this inquiry. It has been his moment, as Cara said, to really land what happened here and who is responsible. And I think let's just end with him and what he said about the work he's done.
No, you've got it. If that's for me, or for my remarkable team, thank you. But you're actually applauding the wrong people. This is your report. I may have done the words. Certainly the errors, the omissions are all mine. And one of them has already been pointed out to me this morning by one of you. But the words come from you and your stories. I want you, please, in a moment, to give me an applause at least as long, and probably longer, standing, if you would, if you can, to those who are really responsible for what is in this report. Look to your right. Look to your left. Look in front. Those of you who can turn, look behind. Those are the people who have written this report, all from your very different perspectives.
The Iranian President, Ebrahim Raisi, has been killed in a helicopter crash. Iran said that had happened this morning. Now, Raisi may not be known to many people here in the West, but he was known as the Butcher of Tehran. He was an ultra-conservative. He presided over the deaths of many, many political opponents and, of course, during a period in Iran where there's been a huge crackdown on rights, particularly the rights of women. And I think Michael Waltz, who is the Republican chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, probably summed up an opinion that would be held by many, many people. He said, good riddance. Raisi was a murderous human rights abuser before and during his presidency. So there'll now be an election in 50 days, but that's going to be a pretty stage-managed affair, to be frank, to be honest, and it'll be under the all-powerful Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei.
I was looking at the reaction to his death just from a Western perspective, and it's very tricky, isn't it? Because a world leader dies in tragic circumstances, and usually there's an outpouring of grief. In fact, what there was an outpouring, at least from where we're sitting. Might not be the same in Iran, admittedly, although, of course, there is a burgeoning resistance movement there that may be applauding this death. But from where we're sitting, people are basically saying, rest in hell. We asked Roland Oliphant, who's our senior foreign correspondent, just to put Raisi into some degree of context and analyse what this might mean for the future of Iran and, of course, the conflict in the Middle East. And Roland started by basically explaining how Raisi got this reputation as you said, Kamal, the Butcher of Tehran.
In 1988, towards the end of the Iran-Iraq War, there was a really horrible incident, went for several months, where the regime put to death, the estimates go up to about 30,000 people, political prisoners, mostly kind of left-wing opponents of the regime, and he was the guy running that, basically, and that's well known in Iran. He picked up this reputation, the slur is the Butcher of Tehran. So very much a hardliner, very much a loyalist in the image of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. And so when he became president in 2021, at the election, he was very much seen as, Khamenei's favoured candidate. A lot of people think the election was basically rigged to get him in there, bearing in mind that Khamenei is 85 years old. He knows he's going to die soon. It was also seen as positioning somebody he liked, who saw himself in his own, someone Khamenei saw in his image, who could maybe take over when he dies. As supreme leader.
Was this death suspicious?
If the president of a country dies in a helicopter crash in a remote location, it takes hours to find the body. I think anybody in any country would be asking questions, but then we're in the realm of speculation, right? I wouldn't rule out anything. We know the Israelis like to kill prominent Iranians. They run these assassination programs. He was coming from Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has a close security relationship with Israel. And you've already got Iranians talking about that. But again, we're in the realm of speculation. I don't have the evidence or any reason to start chucking accusations around. And all we can say now is that, the helicopter crashed, may well have simply been a technical malfunction.
And what does it mean, Roland, for internally in Iran that a hardliner like Raisi has gone? What does it mean for the internal politics of Iran?
I mean, to get the procedure out of the way first, the first vice president, a guy called Mohammad Mokhbar, will take over as a caretaker. He and the head of the judiciary, they have to call an election within 50 days. So we're going to have another presidential election in Iran by the early July, I think.
But not elections as we would imagine.
A presidential election.
These are stage-managed
affairs?
Or?
Well, it's a weird thing in Iran, right? It's is stage-managed. The last one was really stage-managed, and that counted against him because Raisi came in 2021. It was the lowest turnout of any presidential election since the Islamic Revolution. And that had a lot to do with people thinking like all the liberal candidates had been disqualified beforehand. It had the highest number of uncounted votes. There was this real sense. I was there in Tehran, at that time, walking and talking to people. Just a sense of what's the point? Like the regime have just... They've pushed it beyond a joke now. We always knew this was a managed kind of democracy, but there was always this kind of the people had to have their say. And there was the sense was then Khamenei had just had enough. No, you're going to have my guy, and I'm going to do everything to stop any other kind of candidate succeeding in this. And that had a big blow. So I think we'll see a similar kind of thing this time around. I don't think he's going to allow a reformist in, for example, to replace him.
Roland, you've been there in 2021 for the last elections. We've obviously seen lots and lots of reports of internal repression, particularly of women. There have been demonstrations on the streets. What's your view internally of where Iran is now? If you are Iranian and you are trying to see if that country could ever change more positively.
Absolutely frank with you, I'm a complete outsider, don't speak Farsi, but have been there a few times. And I think it's in a really, really delicate place. And if you speak to Iranians, they'll acknowledge that. It's in an economically really difficult place, largely since Donald Trump pulled America out of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. That had a really nasty knock-on effect. So economic doldrums, desperation, you combine that with massive and obvious corruption. The IRGC have taken over large chunks of the economy, which means there's no transparency, which means everybody knows that everything's corrupt and nothing's getting done. And you add to that the repression, like the hijab law is not actually that popular. And you end up with a place where I think it's a very, very divided country. I don't know who would win a free and fair election, but I'll tell you what, when I was there during the election, Raisi won the election. We went down to see his victory rally, and lots of people, lots of hardliners, lots of women all in black, like that, waving their flags, real true believers, right? I don't think you need to bus people in there. There is a hardcore of supporters. But then, classic journalistic situation where where are we going to file? My photographer is I've really got to get some pictures off. I don't want to go back to the hotel. So we sit down on the steps of the metro station around the back of the square in Tehran, just while he tries to get an internet connection that I blow. And, I'm kind of standing around having a cigarette. And this street cleaner spots us and clocks us as foreign journalists. It's like, you're not from around here, right? No, obviously. I was like, right, yeah. And he just points over his shoulder like that and he goes, that bastard. And he just went off on the biggest rant. I just, my jaw hit the floor. And, my government handler is quite happily translating all this. He's the butcher of Tehran. He killed loads of people. Nobody wants him. Look at the state of this place. All of that. That's an ordinary person who just came up to me in Tehran and felt safe doing so. So you're looking at a really tense situation since he came to power. The wave of protests that Iran saw after the death of Mahsa Amini, the biggest, most disruptive wave of protests since the Islamic Revolution that brought this regime to power. It's a really, really delicate time. I don't think they feel weak at the moment. They're quite prepared to crack heads, to kill people to stay in power. But it's a really delicate moment, I think, inside Iran.
I was interested this morning that the leader of Turkey, President Putin in Russia, Xi Jinping in China, all spoke about the loss of a dear friend when they responded to Raisi's death in the helicopter accident. America said that this man was a genocidal, as you said, Roland, hanging judge, and he's been sanctioned by America for many years. In any case, externally, does this have any effect on how Iran positions itself which at the moment appears to be a very aggressive posture towards the Western allies, and very much together with where Russia, China, and that notion of the anti-West axis is. Does that change at all because he has gone, or is that, as you say, Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, who will drive that similarly orthodox, aggressive, anti-West tone?
You can see the world dividing into this kind of new Cold War, right? And there's the kind of collective West on one side, the other side, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, very much in the Russia-China kind of camp. Iran is obviously supplying weapons for Russia's war in Ukraine. That axis, the Iranians very much see that as their place to be, given they feel they're under attack from the West.
And whilst Ali Khamenei remains in power, that's not going to change.
Absolutely not. And he will make sure, as far as he can, that his successor, whoever is going to be installed as supreme leader after him, is loyal to the principles of the Islamic Revolution as he sees it, which includes this definitely this antagonism towards Israel and definitely his general kind of outlook. So I don't really anticipate much change unless the regime itself changes.
What a brilliant summation by Roland there, our Telegraph colleague. Many false dawns about Iran progressing, becoming different, becoming more democratic, but still in the grip, of course, at this moment, of incredibly orthodox, aggressive leadership.
Kamal, I must confess I'm a bit worried about discussing the next subject, cycling, because I once wrote a column at my previous newspaper, the Sunday Express, criticising cyclists, and I don't think I've had more of a backlash in my entire career than from people who prefer two wheels to four. I didn't know what I was talking about. I was ignorant, ill-informed. I think it was...
Camilla, that never happens.
I know.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it.
Such a rare reaction to my work, Kamal. The letters flowed into the editor. It became something of a thing. I went viral, not just on social media, but also on cycling forums. I tell you what, those aren't avenues of discussion that you necessarily want to ride down if you've been blacklisted by the cycling community. The irony, at the time, I was doing a lot of spinning. I was going to spinning classes.
That's a stationary cycle.
Exactly. They resented me when I pointed that out. I said, I understand cycling because I've done spinning. At that point, their level of hatred towards me went up a notch. So we're going to discuss cycling because the readers are, pardon the pun, exercised by the idea, and it's been raised by Simon Heffer of This Parish, associate editor is his title. He's not a man who's afraid of expressing an opinion, Kamal, as you well know. He suggested that cyclists should have number plates because they're a menace on the roads, and if they flout laws, we should be able to hold them responsible for their own bad behaviour.
Now, I am going to maybe be supportive here of that cyclist community, not the aggressive ones, the mammals, the men in lycra who have their very expensive bikes that make crossing the road anywhere in a town or in any area they cycle in absolutely impossible. Not them, but cycling generally must be seen as a good thing. And this idea that it is so dangerous because cyclists are out on the street. I just had a little look at the figures in terms of deaths caused by cycling. Deaths caused by cycling in 2022, 85. Now, of course, each of those is terrible, so not to make light of any of those deaths, but that is the lowest number since 1993, even though loads and loads of people are cycling, which has got to be a good thing for health at least. Same year, 1,711 road deaths. I must admit, people who get cross about cycling, I find, well, is it one of those major issues that's right up there with the really important things in the world?
Can I just, before we go any further,
Please.
can I ask you if you've ever put lycra on to cycle?
I have only because Camilla, let me be clear, only because I go running after I've cycled, and I run in relatively objectionable lycra.
Wow, so you're like doing your own kind of one-man duathlon on any given workout. Okay, that's impressive. I think that cycling is a good thing. I want to agree with you on that for well-being. I think that when cyclists confuse the roads of Britain for a velodrome track, that's when the problems creep in. And we've all been in London. The cycle superhighway was built to make London a bit more like Amsterdam. I love that. The fewer cars there are, the better for all of our health and air pollution and all the rest of it. However, I don't want to be risking life and limb every time I'm crossing a road. And some largely male cyclists are behaving as if they're Chris Hoy at the Olympics, just on the streets of London or beyond. I live in the countryside, as you know, Kamal, and we have this thing where cyclists try to own the road. They're cycling in tandem next to each other so nobody can pass them on country lanes. That is selfish and annoying.
Not only has this been a big discussion in reader comments, but also our wonderful letters pages. And I do just want to read out Mary White from Westcott in Surrey. I hope you're listening, Mary, and if you're not, do plug in to the Daily Tea. She says, I live in the beautiful Surrey Hills.
Lovely.
Seen by the world during the 2012 Olympics when the area was chosen for the cycle road race. Since that time, however, cars have arrived almost every weekend, taking up parking spaces to unload bicycles. Leisure cycling is to be encouraged, but most of these visitors seem keen to emulate the Olympic racers.
Aha.
Naturally slower on the ups, they can ride 3 abreast. On the downs, they reach speeds probably exceeding some of the limits for cars. Just the other morning, walking home from collecting my newspaper, I stopped at the zebra crossing in the middle of our village. Can you imagine the scene, Camilla?
I can.
I could see cyclists approaching down the slope with what I judged to be ample stopping distance. As they sped past without even trying to slow, one shouted, "Can't stop, going too fast." I think Mary raises a very serious point there about the actual danger. Many of these people cycling as well take off the front brakes because it makes them more streamlined.
How is that allowed? How can you take the front brakes off a vehicle that we know can kill people?
Now, Camilla, what I want to know, though, do you agree with Mr. Heffer, who says that they should have number plates?
I initially thought this was a good idea, and then I read some more readers' comments. You gave me Mary White. I raise you Phil Lutterlock. Great name, Phil. And he points out something quite obvious, but it needs to be said. The bureaucracy involved would be monumental and the cost would far outweigh any revenue. I have 5 bikes. Keno. He's definitely got Lycra. What if you're not the registered rider? What about children? Do my 4 grandchildren need registration? Seriously, of all the issues this country faces, this is nothing close to the most important. Cyclists should obey the rules, but licensing is not the answer. That's quite a compelling argument.
I think that's right. I think jumping red lights, riding on pavements, those ludicrous electric bikes that they can now hire that are left all over the place are very, very irritating. Cyclists. I am a cyclist. Be nice, stick by the rules, but also to car drivers, I don't know what you're like in the car, Camilla, but to car drivers, stay behind. And even if you have to go a little slower, how much better that is than in the crazy, wacky races that we used to have driving around cities where there were no bikes and cars drove far too fast.
Now, after I wrote that column, somebody reached out to me, if I can use that Americanism, and he taught cycling in London. He taught people to cycle better, and he invited me on one of his courses. So I spent a whole day with this guy teaching me how to pull out properly, what to be aware of, all of the hazards. Now, I wouldn't cycle in London because I'm too much of a scaredy cat. I do sometimes go out with the kids around the country lanes, but it's not my preferred pastime. Having said that, what the course did was make me far more aware as a driver of how much room you must give cyclists. So when they are 2x2 and I've got room, I give them the widest berth possible. In fact, that's why I resent the 2x2, because you're then inviting the driver to do something quite dangerous. Just go in single file and I will give you a car length space to ensure that you enjoy your day out, and so do I.
OK, that's your pledge, Camilla. The only reason, to be honest, I stop at red lights is because I'm out of breath. So it's a good opportunity to catch your breath when you're a little bit older.
Should we get a 2x2 bike and
tandem around the country, Camilla?
Could I come to North London on the train and then we could tandem into the Daily Tea?
And with that beautiful image in all our minds and the minds of all our listeners, it's time to say goodbye from the Daily Tea. Do join us again tomorrow.